Hey, Keith, I want to go right into you first with a question. We've got a few coming in, but this one's from me. So, with those 8 different seed brands and 86 different hybrids, what's the most important factor or feature for you when you're choosing the right cultivar for your farm or cultivars?
Yeah, for the first thing I would look at would be choosing a herbicide system. If because quite often, Clearfield, we've got pulses into our rotation. So for my farm, I find that the Clearfield doesn't really have a great fit because we want to be able to use that Clearfield herbicide system for controlling weeds in our pulses. So I would end up, looking for a Liberty or Roundup system, number one. And I do rotate every couple of years. I'll rotate from one to the other, and so that would be the first one that I would look at. Then after that, I would match it up to my risk. Like for my area, I would say, gee, I might be able to get a little bit more yield out of having a longer growing seed, out of having a longer maturity variety. But do I want to accept that risk on my farm? We've had, like this past year, yeah, we had with the extra heat units, we were really great, but we've had some years that we're really pushed and we're out there waiting for the snow to melt so we can get back out. And so I always take and I like to make sure I'm not too high on the risk. So that's going to vary from one farm in one area, this Western Canada, to another. That's what I use on my farm.
Okay, so Nate, I'm gonna build on that and go to you. So the CPT trials that Keith talked about, we know the days to maturity for each cultivar in the trials. But what you're saying is that almost, well, not more important, but is that period up until first flower. So if you've got a shorter period to first flower and longer flowering, you're more likely to yield more. So can we track? I don't think CPT does this yet, but is it fairly easy for a farmer to find out information on days to first flower?
For canola, not really, no. So days to first flower, it can sometimes be related to maturity. So those earlier maturing hybrids might flower earlier. This is data that is probably collected in breeding trials by life science companies or publicly funded breeding programs. They look at flowering timing, flowering duration, and maybe even within flowering, once 20, 30, 40, etc. But once further down the road, I'm not sure if this data is available.
Okay, one more quick one for you, Nate, and then I got one for Paul. So Carol's asking about flower size. And so do you know if we've seen anything on a correlation between flower size and yield?
Yeah, so which part of the flower is getting bigger? Can I answer a question with a question? A flower has pollen on the stigma, and that goes down, or sorry, pollen on the anther, and it goes onto the stigma. They talk, they communicate, and then reproduction happens. And if one of these gets bigger, or maybe both get bigger, does this increase yield further down the road? I don't know. To be quite honest, Carol, you've added some reading to my reading list.
Okay, this is a good question for Paul. And Nate, you can jump in, but we'll go to Paul first. So Manasseh asks, what might have led to the better than expected yields in Manitoba, considering how dry and hot it was?
Yeah, that is a tough question. I think that what we've seen even the last few years, we've gone through a more or less kind of a drier stretch for many areas, especially in Manitoba. But Manitoba does have some heavier soils, and it does have some groundwater systems that I think in some cases will benefit the crops, and perhaps more so than we're really accounting for in some of our yield and moisture model type research. So that's the only thing I could really pull out there, because boy, with that kind of heat and that sort of impact it has on flowering and days in flower and that kind of thing, boy, there really wasn't a lot very beneficial. So it's a tough one to call. Possibly the moisture wasn't quite as bad as the lack of rainfall would indicate if there's another source, like a subsurface source of water in some areas.
Nate, would you add to that? Anything to add?
Just that, precipitation can be so spotty. And I think that we saw a lot of that in 2021. For example, I live just south of Carmen, Manitoba, and the quarter that I live on was canola this year, and it went just low 40s. And so, the farmers were happy with that. I think it was 7 or 8 miles east of my place, there were fields there that were averaging below 10. So not that far away. Heat temperature was probably very similar, in an 8-mile, 7-mile distance, but where I live, there's just a little bit more rain, and rain makes grain.
Any other notable observations between those two sites that sprung to mind for you?
Uniformity, that was also because of the rain, and this rain, this was the beginning of June 9th, I think, was when this event went through. So it affected the duration, it affected the rest of the growing season. Yeah.
Hey Keith, how was your yield based on what you thought it might have been, given the heat and the dry?
I mean, it varied from one end of our farm to the other. We had one part of our farm, like up by Maidstone, that ended up getting 8 tenths of rain one week, whereas down by Lone Rock at home, we had 2 tenths, and that was 10 bushels the acre difference. And so down at Lone Rock, we were sitting at about a half a crop, and up at Maidstone, probably 75% crop. So yeah, if you got a little bit of rain right in that heat spot, or just after that crop could recover, it made a huge difference.
I want to get into some of these facts. I know, so Nate, you made the point quite clearly that environment is the big one. So genetics are all good. Farm management in general is good. It's environment. But I'm going to give me a sec because I want to say one more thing from the chat. But I do want you to think about answering a question on how do we weatherproof canola? So how do we manage better around some of these big environmental issues? But before that, so we got a chat from John. So this is John just saying his checklist when he's choosing a variety. Club root tolerance is first. John is in Alberta, but we want everyone to think about club root tolerance. Second is herbicide system. So Keith that puts that first, John puts that second. Third is maturity. So again, Keith, you mentioned that as well. Harvest management is fourth, and yield is fifth. Again, all of the canola varieties yield pretty well. There are some that stand out some years, but if you want to manage risk, it's some of these other factors. And then of course there's disease management and disease tolerance and resistance in there as well. Okay, Nate. So I gave you 30 seconds to think about an answer. What are you going to say?
Right. So similarly to, developing varieties that are resistant to clubroot or blackleg, we are doing this for climate related things as well. Drought, heat, even increasing nutrient use efficiency in canola and in other crops too. But, there's like Dr. Sally Vale at Saskatoon, she's looking at drought tolerance. Dr. Malcolm Morrison at Ottawa's looked at drought tolerance and heat blast before. Dr. Rob Duncan at the University of Manitoba, Chad Kaselny, Pioneer, everybody's doing this. So it's very similar to selecting for blackleg resistance, clubroot resistance. We're selecting for, stomatal conductance and mesophyll conductance and things like that, that will regulate water, or maybe there's a more waxy surface, and this will help with, light penetration and things like that. You're muted, Jay.
Thanks. Thanks, Nate. It was bound to happen. Keith, I saw you light up. Did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I would. I lit up because I'd forgot to mute myself, but I did want to go back to John's comment, John Mako's comment about clubroot. In our area, yeah, to me, that's a number one, and I forgot to mention that. I mean, we don't have the amount of clubroot in our area that they would, up in Vegreville where John farms or in that Edmonton area, but it is a risk, and it's a risk that we can't afford to take. So that's number one of my priority for choosing a variety too.
Okay, we're going to talk about emergence. You know, and Nate, you know this. Well, all three of you know this. You know, data shows that seeding the beginning of May tends to yield more than the end of May. But over the past couple of years, we're starting to wonder if maybe waiting for the soils to emerge or warm up a little bit so we get faster emergence might be another factor. But there's so much that goes into early seeding. But here's the question from Orest. Why, when germination for top seed is well over 90%, why do we only get 60% emergence? So what's going on, and how do we manage for better emergence? Nate, do you want to start with this?
Sure. I don't think I have an answer. It's a really, really good question. It's like $1 million question. There's so many different things that drive the rate of emergence. You know, soil temperature, soil moisture, the residue, the preceding crop, whatever was grown there last year, row spacing, the spacing between seeds, plant densities, you know, your openers, is it planted, is it seeded, is it broadcast? Is it broadcast by plane? Like, there's so much, right? And I would encourage, you know, so I don't have an answer, and it's going to be different for every farm across the prairies. And you know, the way to move forward is to start counting plants in the spring, and you know, maybe try out a couple different things. You know, use a hoop. We have a good tool. The Canola Council has a good Canola Counts tool that can be found on our website. And you know, we came up with a map, a prairie-wide map this fall, showing, you know, the percent emergence across the prairies. And you know, we want to do this moving forward as well. So I think it starts, you know, with really good, diligent record keeping, and then you evaluate your management practices or whatever it was that you've kind of changed or altered or tweaked, optimized, hopefully, with the results, and then we move forward.
Okay, Paul, I've got a question for you, and I'm so glad this question came in because we've got a weather specialist here, and so we just have to take a couple minutes to talk about what's going to happen in 2022. So do you have any idea what the weather probabilities are heading into 2022?
No, not really. You know, I'm long enough in the tooth trying to deal with this to know better. You know, you can try and take a stab at it. There's some things that we can know, like Les Henry's soil moisture map. That's 100%. You know that. There's no question about it. But you know, honestly, we could, if you're somewhere in Western Saskatchewan, you're saying, wow, it's really dry, you know, well, that can change. That can literally change in a day. And so what do I know for sure? Not anything for sure, but what seems to be happening, and there is physical reasons why it may be in our weather system, is the variability, and the fact that we're seeing a lazier jet stream with very deep wavy patterns that are persistent. So if it gets dry over a region on a synoptic scale, it's likely to sit there for a while, which is not good. And the flip side is that if you happen to be on the other side of that jet position and you're getting wet, you're probably going to continue to get wet. And then when it shifts around, it goes to the other extreme. So the Western Canada sits right in the path of the mid-latitude westerly airflow on the planet. And that airflow is becoming more lazy and meandering, and it's causing more variability. And so, you know, that it's hard enough to predict at the best of times, but I think it's going to become even more variable and more unpredictable. That's my prognostication.
Keith or Nate, either of you want to jump in on that one?
Oh, I can't predict the weather. If I could predict the weather, I'd probably be retired by now. I'm the youngest one here.
So, Paul, I have a follow-up question for you, and it was one you showed that vegetation index map from StatCan.
Yeah.
So this is more of an in-season situation map. This is where we're at to date. But do you see a way where farmers could use that for decision making?
On a farm scale, probably not. That map is designed for broad area coverage. It uses the NOAA and the MODIS satellites that are fairly coarse resolution. So they lend themselves to that. And what they do is they provide, even if it was higher resolution, it's a snapshot of where the vegetation is right at the current point in time. Now, my experience in this area is that one picture is nice, but not very useful. What's really helpful is to see how that vegetation develops over the growing season, because that can tell you a lot more than just one picture at one point. So it can be used if you wanted to, but there's a lot of work involved, and you have to have high enough resolution to see what's going on in your own local area, which you can't get with all satellites. Maybe we're going to do it with drones and things instead. I don't know, but you need a picture over the growing season. You've got to start following it sometime from when you start to get good vegetative growth up to the peak, and be able to do things very similar to what Nate was talking about. How long does it stay in these stages? This is what it could possibly help you with, but it does require some effort to get it.
Well, you three, we're at 12:58, so we have about a minute left. And I do want to get a last word from each of you. A key message, maybe one more question, Nate. So perhaps we'll go in order of presentations. So Paul, right back to you. What would be your closing soundbite?
Well, I mean, I think there's been a lot of things acknowledged here that we know. You can't control weather. You have control over what you select. And what Nate said, I think, really brings it home. Where you put your boots on the ground, what works for you there is not necessarily going to be the same as your neighbor just a few miles away. And becoming more cognizant of those risks, trying things and doing things on farm, I think needs to become more prevalent in what we do, to try to make use of this information to make our decisions more distributed for the location and better informed. That's the best that we can do.
Thanks, Paul. Nate?
Yeah, just, record keeping, I think, is just, it's so important. And we think that we can remember everything. Like, how often have you said, oh yeah, I'll remember that, for no, we never do, right? So yeah, just write it down, right? Like I gave up trying to remember things for later. I have a notepad on my bedside table, I write everything down. And then going back and evaluating these records, and this takes time. It's a lot of work to go back and to sift through it all and to try to find out maybe where there's room for improvement. And I can empathize with that.
Keith, last word to you. You're on mute.
Thank you. I would say to do what's right for your farm, and what's right for your farm isn't the what's right for the neighbor's farming. We all have that different risk tolerance. We have that different equipment I talked about before. So find what works for your farm under your situation and your management conditions that you are in your risk tolerance, and just go with that.
Well, thanks, you three.